WWE managers weren't sidekicks. They were the ones shaping how the audience read every match. Bobby Heenan stood beside Andre the Giant, Ric Flair, and Mr. Perfect during their biggest WWF championship runs, and years later, the Mega Powers storyline turned Randy Savage's closest relationship into the thing that ended his own title chase. That's why today I'm ranking the 6 most legendary WWE managers and what each one changed about the business. Starting with the one who made his entrance on the back of a donkey, Bobby the Brain, Heenan. The greatest wrestling manager of all time did wrestle matches, including a win over Mr. Fuji, and plenty of fans and commentators still consider him one of the greatest wrestling managers ever. There, I said it. That's a strange sentence to defend about a man who spent most of his career standing outside the ropes, but the tape shows why so many people rate him among the very best. At WrestleMania 9 in 1993, Heenan rode into the arena backward on a camel, creating one of the night's funniest spectacles, while still embodying the sharp, widely respected wrestling mind that made him a legend. That's not a contradiction, that's the whole job description. Heenan first showed up in the WWF in November 1984 in Big John Studd's corner, and within a few years, he'd built something that looked less like a stable of clients and more like a hostile takeover of the main event scene. When your roster includes Andre the Giant, King Kong Bundy, Mr. Perfect, Rick Rude, and Ric Flair, you're not managing wrestlers anymore. You're managing outcomes. Andre the Giant beat Hulk Hogan for the WWF Championship on February 5, 1988, with Heenan aligned with Andre, making the victory feel like the payoff to a rivalry that had been building for years. Flair won the WWF Championship in 1992, with Heenan advising him throughout his WWF run from 1991 to 1993, selling every word of it like the outcome was already decided. Heenan helped make the threat feel real because he knew how to draw the audience into it, and that's a skill that became one of his defining strengths. Then he'd sit down at the commentary desk next to Gorilla Monsoon and undercut that exact same threat with a joke. The man who could make a 500-pound giant sound unbeatable was the same one calling him a genetic jackhammer 30 seconds later. That's the range Heenan became especially known for. He could sell menace and puncture it in the same breath, and neither performance made the other one feel dishonest. Think about what that actually requires. With Heenan, the job was to make the man beside him seem capable of hurting the audience's hero and, without missing a beat, make the manager himself the funniest guy in the room. Heenan entered the WWE Hall of Fame in 2004. He'd become a full-time commentator after retiring from managing in 1991, later making sporadic appearances and providing comments for WWE documentary releases, proof the character never needed a client to keep working. Randy Savage would learn just how personal this business could get when his own corner turned into the thing that broke him. But Heenan showed that the voice beside the ring could become a major attraction in its own right, client or no client. One of Heenan's greatest strengths was shaping how the audience saw his clients and their biggest moments. The next test is whether that voice can survive doing it for champions, comedians, monsters, and a record-setting reign all at once. Jimmy Hart. At WrestleMania, one match was commonly called 9 seconds, though one account puts the official time closer to 24, and the loudest voice at ringside may not have belonged to the guy fighting. King Kong Bundy flattened Special Delivery Jones before you could finish reading this sentence out loud, and Jimmy Hart stood at ringside the entire time, screaming through a megaphone, turning a total mismatch into a moment later wrestling retrospectives still revisit. Bundy supplied the squash. Hart supplied the reason to care, and Hart's ringside presence is part of what later coverage associates with his wrestling persona. Decades later, coverage still emphasizes how quickly the match ended. The easy read on Jimmy Hart is comic mouthpiece. Loud shirts, a megaphone gimmick, a guy built to make a monster feel scarier for half a minute at a time. Heenan had already proven a manager's voice could make one legend feel bigger. Hart's contribution was showing how one recognizable voice could stand beside entirely different acts, from monsters to tag teams to a musical champion, which is a bigger trick than it sounds. Hillbilly Jim recommended him to Vince McMahon in 1985. By 1987, that move had put Hart beside championship teams and champions, across wrestlers with very different presentations. In early 1987, with Hart managing them, Bret Hart and Jim Neidhart, the Hart Foundation, beat the British Bulldogs for the WWF Tag Team Championship, one of 2 reigns in the team's history. Tag wrestling runs on chemistry and timing rather than raw menace, which meant Hart had to sell teamwork instead of size, a completely different pitch than the one he'd made for Bundy. Then came the Honky Tonk Man. Vain, musical, allergic to actual fighting, a resume that shouldn't work on anybody, and somehow became Intercontinental Champion in June 1987. Bundy needed menace. The Hart Foundation needed you to believe two guys trusted each other. Honky needed a crowd to believe a coward could still walk out champion. Hart supplied all three reads with the same recognizable managerial persona, and the megaphone kept showing up. The documented results included championships for the Hart Foundation and Honky Tonk Man. That's not a manager who found one trick and reused it. That's a manager who could read what an act actually required and hand it over on command while keeping a recognizable voice throughout. Hart's range stands out because he worked with wildly different kinds of acts across his career. How many could plausibly stand next to a giant monster, a tag team, and a fake rock star and sound like they belonged in all three spots? Not many. He entered the WWE Hall of Fame in 2005 with championship stories across several different kinds of act on his resume, using one tool the whole time. The megaphone made noise. What Hart actually sold was belief, custom-fitted to whoever was standing next to him, whether that meant a giant, a duo, or a musical champion. And that same industry was about to aim a manager's control somewhere far uglier than comedy, straight at a wrestler's real marriage instead of his win column, which is exactly the position Randy Savage was walking into. Then the arena can fall completely silent, and a single reaction from the corner can carry an entire championship story. Miss Elizabeth. She was best known not for physical interference, but for standing at the emotional center of Randy Savage's biggest WWF stories. And she rarely spoke, almost never needing a microphone, yet she still ended up standing at the emotional center of the Hogan-Savage championship story that culminated at WrestleMania 5. That is the entire contradiction of Miss Elizabeth, unlike the louder, more intervention-heavy styles associated with some managers. Elizabeth built her influence through presence and emotion, and stillness turned out to be just as dangerous as any of it. She showed up in Randy Savage's corner in a segment taped on July 30th, 1985, airing that August, and from the start, she was presented through presence and emotion rather than loud promos. Where the other cornermen postured and interfered, Elizabeth mostly just watched, and the camera watched her watching right alongside the crowd. On February 8, 1986, she was there when Savage beat Tito Santana for the Intercontinental Championship, and her reaction sold the moment more than the pinfall itself did. 2 years later, at WrestleMania 4 on March 27, 1988, she walked him through a one-night 14-man tournament to the WWF Championship, and her face registering each near miss added emotional weight to the run. The detail that makes her a genuine outlier among ringside figures is simple. She carried story weight through presence, emotion, and body language rather than relying on loud promos. Bobby Heenan told you what to think. Elizabeth showed you what to feel. The result was a presentation that invited the audience to read her instead of spelling out every feeling. That invitation paid off, and then it broke something. The Mega Powers pairing turned Elizabeth from Savage's silent asset into his greatest liability. Jealousy surrounding her became one of the wedges that split the Mega Powers. A glance lasted too long. A hand landed on her shoulder at the wrong moment. None of it required a word, and all of it detonated a partnership between the two biggest stars in the company, dragging Savage's championship reign down with it and turning his defining year into a slow unraveling he never fully controlled. It built to WrestleMania 5 on April 6, 1989, where Hogan beat Savage for the title in a match that was really a referendum on who Elizabeth belonged to, and Savage lost both the belt and the friendship in the same night. Sensational Sherry brought a more conspicuous physical presence to the moments described here. Elizabeth could make her point through presence and emotion. 2 years after the title was gone and the friendship was gone, she was still the emotional focus of the moment. At WrestleMania 7 on March 24, 1991, after Savage lost what was billed as his last match, she walked back down the aisle to comfort him. And that single image did more storytelling than a monologue could have managed. Fans still remember her reunion with Savage at WrestleMania 7 as one of the most emotional moments in WWF history, while the record does not establish her current Hall of Fame status or explain the reason for it. What she pulled off is the interesting part. A woman whose influence was usually carried by reactions, rather than microphone work or physical interference, still helped redirect a championship program, largely through her face and her timing. That is a different definition of managerial power than anything covered so far on this list, one measured in silence instead of scripts. And it raises an uncomfortable question about every manager still to come. If Elizabeth-related jealousy could help fracture one of the promotion's biggest partnerships, what happens when someone standing in that exact same spot also holds actual gold? That quiet power creates a sharper question. What happens when the person in the corner arrives with a title of her own? Sensational Sherry. Sherry Martel walked into her first WWF match and walked out as champion, and the woman she beat was the trainer who helped teach her the business. That's the kind of debut that instantly becomes memorable, and Sherry got it on her very first night. She got it on July 24, 1987, dethroning Fabulous Moolah, the same Moolah who had trained her and was associated with the women's title for years. You don't often get a debut this dramatic. Beat the champion, and the line disappears entirely. Sherri skipped it anyway. Here's what makes that debut matter beyond the shock value. She held the title for 440 days. That's well over a year of title defenses against Debbie Combs, Velvet McIntyre, and Desiree Peterson, a run long enough to make her the presumptive face of the entire women's division. The reign finally ended on October 8, 1988, when Rockin' Robin beat her clean. Sherri built a lengthy 440-day reign, defended the title, and then handed it off on the record's terms. What that gives Sherri is a championship resume before she ever steps into her next act. Elizabeth's power was emotional, a woman standing at ringside whose presence alone could tilt a crowd's sympathy toward Randy Savage without her throwing a punch. Sherri walks into her next act carrying a championship resume, actual in-ring credibility earned through more than a year of title defenses, and that gives her presence at ringside a different context. When she starts managing Randy Savage as Macho King, she's not just decoration next to his throne, she's a woman who has already won and held a championship on her own, standing beside a man whose own storyline in the Mega Powers had already turned his closest relationship into a fault line of its own. Savage wanted the gold and the girl, and the story never let that stay simple. Sherri's arrival afterward, as a champion in her own right rather than a supporting act, reframes what a manager's corner is capable of holding, and she didn't stop with Savage. When Shawn Michaels went out on his own as a singles competitor, Sherri was right there, tied to the original recording of his theme song, supplying vocals for the tune that became Sexy Boy, a song closely associated with Shawn Michaels. Think about that career arc for a second. A trainer's protege wins a title in her first match, defends it for over a year, pivots into managing Randy Savage during a storyline that pulled Hulk Hogan and Miss Elizabeth into direct conflict with Savage and Sherri, then pivots again to lend her voice to Shawn Michaels' early identity. 3 separate performers, across different points in the company's history, and Sherri is the constant thread running through all of them. One way to read that career arc is as evidence that Sherri could adapt her managerial presence to different performers, different gimmicks, and different stakes, again and again. WWE honored that career in 2006, inducting her into the Hall of Fame with Ted DiBiase doing the honors, a fitting choice given how much of that era ran through the same circle of heel royalty. By the time she's done, Sherri has answered the question Elizabeth's section left hanging. A manager's authority can come from proven competitive dominance just as easily as from emotional presence. And when both are on the table, the corner stops looking like a sideline and starts looking like a throne. Because once a manager proves she can win the whole division on her own merit, the next question is obvious. What happens when that same authority stops being about who stands beside the champion and starts rewriting what the champion's entire story is allowed to mean? Paul Bearer. Who gets to decide what a champion actually is? Not the champion alone. In WWE's early 90s, that power sat with a ghoulish mortician carrying an urn, Paul Bearer, a name built on Paul Bearer, who managed The Undertaker, the dead man. Bill Moody signed his first WWF contract on December 22, 1990, and within weeks the company had built an entire character around a pun, the mortuary suit, the high, sing-song voice that sounded like it belonged to someone narrating his own funeral, the urn clutched like a remote control, because, in a way, that's exactly what it was. Fans already understood that a manager could talk for a wrestler, cut the promos the wrestler couldn't, sell the fight before it happened. Bearer's job centered on reinforcing The Undertaker's supernatural mythology. His urn supposedly supplied The Undertaker's actual supernatural power, which made the object in a manager's hands central to The Undertaker's supernatural presentation. Bearer's urn arrangement was a distinctive part of the roster's supernatural pageantry. A referee counts to 3 and a match ends. Bearer just had to hold a jar. That idea was part of Bearer's early WWF presentation. His first appearance as Paul Bearer came in early 1991, after he joined the WWF. And from that moment, the comparison to the rest of the manager landscape got easy to draw. Sherri sold Savage's championship legitimacy through toughness, through win streaks, through screaming at ringside like the outcome of the match was a personal insult to her. Bearer sold mythology instead, reinforcing The Undertaker's supernatural character. He narrated a character whose supernatural strength was tied to a prop that became central to storylines whenever it was stolen or recovered, which is a strange kind of job security for a man whose role was to manage, not physically compete. That control got a second air when Kane arrived, and Bearer became manager to both brothers at once, turning a family history into a storyline WWE could run into the summer of 1998. Picture the pitch meeting. So we've got one brother whose powers come from an urn, and now we're adding a second brother who was supposedly burned alive and also wants the urn guy's attention. Somebody in that room said yes, and the yes worked. Here's the detail that makes it dangerous, though. The same man holding the urn that powered one brother was also the man who knew where the other brother came from. Two competitors, one keeper of the truth between them. That's the same kind of personal fault line that split the mega powers apart. A trusted figure standing at the center of a relationship built to break. It broke Bearer's side first. In 1996, he betrayed The Undertaker and aligned with Mankind, and the urn stopped being a source of power and became a weapon pointed at the man it once protected. Years of mythology, years of the urn controls the dead man, got weaponized in a single storyline turn. The prop was never just a prop, it was leverage, and leverage changes hands. Add that to the list of things a man in a suit apparently controlled. A man's strength, a family's secrets, and eventually the loyalty of the entire storyline. Bearer died on March 5, 2013 at 58, and WWE inducted him into its Hall of Fame the following year. His significance is not captured by a wrestler-style win-loss column. What he actually leaves behind is a blueprint. A manager whose voice, ghostly presentation, and urn became so fused with The Undertaker's supernatural identity that removing Bearer from the story would have changed what The Undertaker was. That's not narration anymore. That's authorship. That kind of authorship over meaning doesn't stay confined to graveyards and urns forever. Give it enough ambition, and it stops managing a wrestler's mythology and starts managing the mythology of an entire promotion. Paul Heyman. Paul Heyman is best known for helping other wrestlers win championships, not for winning them himself, and his influence across wrestling has been unusually broad. Think about that for a second. Earlier managers commonly borrowed heat from a wrestler's push, worked at ringside, and helped sell the act with a promo. Heyman did that too, but he also took on responsibilities far beyond the classic ringside role, starting on January 2, 1987, first as a manager and later under the name Paul E. Dangerously, a loudmouth with a cordless phone who sounded like he was always closing a deal, phone call included. That's the entry point. And on its own, it's a footnote, the kind of detail that shows up in a trivia question and nowhere else. What he built after it is the reason his name closes this list. By the 1990s, Heyman was managing wrestlers in WCW's Dangerous Alliance and running a company at the same time. Extreme Championship Wrestling was a Philadelphia-based promotion when he took creative control of it in 1993, and it later struggled financially, even as it became the place that reinvented what a wrestling show could look like. Hardcore violence treated as art, promos that ran 5 minutes without a wasted word, a tone that would influence major wrestling promotions in the years that followed. ECW closed in 2001, bankrupt, gone, done. The style outlived the company that built it. The talent pipeline it produced launched numerous future stars, including Taz, Rob Van Dam, the Dudley Boys, and Tommy Dreamer, and the aggressive, reality-based style Heyman helped develop in ECW carried that influence into the promotions that followed it. A company can fold. Its ideas can outlive the company that created them. Heyman joined WWE in 2001 and spent years doing almost every job the company had. Commentator, writer, producer, manager, and eventually SmackDown general manager. The kind of resume that reads like a man who couldn't decide which part of the business he wanted to control, so he took all of it. Then, on May 7, 2012, he walked back out to a WWE ring for the first time in years and introduced himself as Brock Lesnar's advocate. That word choice was the whole strategy. An advocate argues on behalf of someone who supposedly can't argue for himself, and Heyman used it to turn Lesnar into a weapon that talked through a translator, a monster whose menace got explained to you in real time by the one man alive who claimed to understand it. Many Lesnar matches became Heyman promos first, sometimes with a longer and more memorable promo than the match itself. The numbers he'd rattle off, the F5, the Suplex City, the countdown to whatever streak Lesnar was about to end, all of it landed because Heyman built the language before Lesnar ever threw a punch. Take the promo away and Lesnar is still terrifying. Leave it in and he's terrifying with a narrator, which turns out to be a very different product. And here's where Randy Savage's story from earlier in this video gets uncomfortable to sit with again. Savage lost control of his own narrative the moment Miss Elizabeth became a storyline instead of a marriage. His closest relationship turned into leverage by people who weren't him. Heyman's clients avoided that particular trap, because Heyman made sure the story always ran through him, on purpose, by design, with the wrestler's full knowledge and benefit. That's the difference between a manager who gets used by the machine and a manager who becomes the machine, which brings us to 2020 and Roman Reigns. Reigns had spent years fighting the fans over whether he deserved to be the guy. Heyman arrived as his special counsel and rewrote the entire premise. Reigns became the tribal chief, a head of the table who didn't need your permission, and many of Reigns' title defenses got framed as family matters as well as wrestling matches. Losses became strategy. Wins became inevitability. That's a different kind of authorship than standing at ringside yelling instructions. It writes the story before the match happens, instead of reacting to one already in motion. Traditional managers often react to a push that's already in motion. Heyman got there early enough to help design the push itself. Look at WWE's own list of what Heyman has been across one career. ECW owner, SmackDown general manager, Raw commentator, Brock Lesnar's advocate, Roman Reigns' Wiseman, Seth Rollins' Oracle, and a WWE Hall of Famer inducted in 2024. Some fans still argue about whether he should be ranked as a manager, a promoter, or a writer, and whether the Lesnar partnership or the Reigns partnership was the stronger act. The honest answer is that he was all three roles simultaneously for decades, across companies he owned and companies that employed him. Ask 5 fans which era was the best, and you'll get 5 different decades, and every single one of them will have a case. Every manager on this list expanded the job somewhere. One made a monster believable, one made a valet the emotional center of a marquee match, one made ringside authority feel like a governing body handed down from the office itself. Heyman combined several expansions of the role across his career, adding management to booking, ownership, and commentary, on top of a promotion he took creative control of and later owned, and a promo language the entire industry still speaks. It's the difference between improving one room in a house and owning the whole building, then renting rooms back to everyone who used to live there. The greatest manager controls the meaning around the star, and Heyman made that meaning large enough to contain a promotion, a champion, and a dynasty. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.